All right, hello everyone and welcome. So our learning lab today is Introduction to Affordable Housing Finance and Development. We're really excited to have you all here with us today. And we'll just start off by introducing ourselves, and we'll hopefully get to know you all a little better as well. So my name is Adrienne Gemhart. I am a housing finance consultant with the California Housing Partnership. I am based in Sacramento. And prior to being a housing finance consultant, I worked as a project manager with Mutual Housing California, where I focused on managing new construction, affordable housing developments in the Sacramento area. And I'll pass it on to my team to introduce themselves as well.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ben Creed. I'm also a housing finance consultant at the California Housing Partnership. I was previously a project manager at West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation and worked mainly on new construction developments in LA County.
And I'm Janice Choi, also a housing finance consultant with the California Housing Partnership. I'm based in LA now, but I actually used to be a project manager up in San Francisco, the Chinatown Community Development Center. I focus mainly on rehabs there. So I'll be talking about that later in the presentation. Chad, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. And hi, I'm Chad Horsford, a senior housing finance consultant with California Housing Partnership. I'm based in LA, and I'll be monitoring the chat today.
Awesome. So a little bit about the California Housing Partnership and the work that we do. So this is our mission. The California Housing Partnership creates and preserves affordable and sustainable homes for Californians with low incomes by providing expert financial and policy solutions to nonprofit and public partners. So our work really combines both technical expertise as well as advocacy leadership. So while we provide financial consulting, we also work in policy and research and also have housing data tools that offer access to an affordable properties map and housing needs dashboard throughout California. So just a little bit of housekeeping. So I know we're all pretty familiar with Zoom at this point, but we'd love to ask everyone to rename yourself with your name, pronouns, and also the organization that you're working at. We'd love to have everyone use the chat feature to ask questions, and we're also going to have some prompts to respond to. So as much participation as you're open to, we'd love that. We're excited to hear from all of you as well as answer questions, and Chad will be monitoring that chat. If you could keep your sound on mute and unmute yourself only when speaking. And if possible, we'd love to have everyone keep their cameras on. All right, so just to get to know a little bit about all of you, we have some poll questions that you'll be seeing pop up, including what is your current role in affordable housing and how long you've been working in affordable housing. So the poll is being launched now. And I'll give everyone a little bit of time to answer. Awesome. About half of the people have answered. A lot of things coming in. Okay, I'll give it a couple more seconds. All right, let's take a look at the results. So it looks like we have people from all over. So lenders, investors, folks from public agencies, housing development team members, and as well as a wide range of lengths that people have been working in the industry. So we're really excited to have all of you here today. And if you could just put in the chat, so we're just curious to see what people are hoping to learn from this learning lab. We're going to be covering a wide range of topics, but it's always helpful for us to know if there are particular items of interest. All right, as we're looking at that, we'll keep moving. So here's our agenda today. So we're going to be starting with an overview, just really grounding ourselves in what are we going to be talking about, what is affordable housing, and then moving into the project life cycle, looking at a case study, and then moving through construction, lease up and operations, and recapitalization. Okay, starting in our overview. So what are we talking about today? What type of housing? So we all know that there's both market rate housing and affordable housing. Today, we're just going to be talking about affordable housing. While there are affordable homeownership opportunities, we're just going to be talking about affordable rental housing. And there are different types of affordable housing. There might be short-term affordable housing. We're talking about permanent housing rather than transitional housing or shelter housing. So here are a variety of types of affordable housing. So perhaps you've heard of naturally occurring affordable housing. So this is housing that does not have any type of restrictions on it. It's technically market rate, but it might be relatively affordable. There's rent-controlled housing, inclusionary housing, public housing, which is completely owned and operated by housing authorities. There's rent subsidized housing, which is accessed through a tenant-based Section 8 voucher that can be applied to market rate housing. But today we're talking about publicly financed or subsidized affordable housing, particularly through the low-income housing tax credit program. While there are some other publicly financed affordable housing programs, specifically HUD programs, we're really just going to be focusing on low-income housing tax credit affordable housing today. All right, so some definitions just so we can understand each other through this presentation. Affordable is defined as paying less than 30% of your household income towards rent and utilities. Rent burdened means that you're paying more than 30%, but less than 50% of your income towards rent utilities, while severely rent burdened is paying over 50% of your income towards the rent and utilities. And we're defining low income as less than 80% of the area median income, with area median income usually focusing on a county-wide region. So it's the median income of the county. So some examples. So for someone making, for say a family of four making the median income in Los Angeles County, that means their income is $120,000 with an affordable rent being around $3,000. For a one-person household making $84,000, the affordable rent would be around $2,100. So even these, you can find these rent levels in Los Angeles. But when you look at people who have very low incomes, that's extremely difficult to find as far as market rate housing. And if you look at extremely low, you're looking at a family of four making around $36,000. And the rent that would be affordable at that level is $900, which you're not going to be able to find on the market. So that's where affordable LIHTC housing comes in to provide housing options for people who have very low and extremely low incomes. All right, so now we are going to start moving through the project life cycle. So in the beginning of a project, it really starts with an idea or a concept. So when you're contemplating or your organization is contemplating moving forward with a development project, some of the questions that you might ask initially are, is this project mission aligned? So is it going to further our mission? Is the timing right for the organization? And what is our goal and vision for this project? And that process might take up to a year or around a year. Once that idea is moved forward, you're then in the stage of feasibility and pre-development, which we'll go into in a lot more detail, but that could take 1 to 3 years. And once that is complete, you begin the construction phase, which is typically 12 to 24 months, followed by lease up, which is around 3 to 6 months, and operations, which is in California, a minimum of 55 years, with the goal of having the housing affordable in perpetuity. And then into recapitalization, which usually happens around year 15. And we'll also be discussing that more later today. All right, so for feasibility and pre-development, there are a couple different parts, with the first part being site selection that we'll talk about, followed by assembling a team, the design of the project, and then financing. So first we'll look at site selection. So there are many different ways to acquire land. So one possibility is that a jurisdiction or public agency will issue a request for proposal or an RFP, which is a competition among developers to acquire land, which will be used to develop affordable housing. So developers will submit their ideas and their plan for the given site in hopes of acquiring that land. Land can be purchased on the market. It can be donated, or if the land is not owned, there can be a ground lease where the public agency retains ownership, but the land is leased for the development of affordable housing. And there are a handful of things to consider when looking for land. So one might be if your organization is targeting a specific neighborhood or area, so the location of the site. Other things to consider are the cost. So is it financially feasible to move forward with the given piece of land? Does the land have any environmental issues that make it very difficult to develop on? What kind of design limitations will there be on that site? And are there any relocation requirements? So either commercial or residential. And what do the amenities look like? Are there schools nearby, grocery stores, public transportation, medical care? And so while all these are very important to consider for the residents who will be living on site, it also is important in securing financing, as it is required for many funding sources to have amenities nearby. All right, so on to assembling a team. So you'll see here at the center is the developer and owner, as shown by the project manager, who's really coordinating all the consultants and is acting as the decision maker. So on here, you'll see the financial consultant, which is us, who is helping determine financial feasibility. So once you have information about the project, what it's going to look like, we can help you determine if this is a financially feasible project and if it makes sense to continue moving forward, or how to make it pencil. You'll have the architect on your team who helps with concept design, massing studies, density and zoning analysis, and just really helping you determine what's possible on your site. There are engineers who in the pre-development phase are looking at environmental issues, soils. You'll have the general contractor who helps with the initial cost estimating and the construction feasibility. And then your attorney, who is very important throughout the project, but in the pre-development phase, a big one that they're going to help with is site control. And again, that the developer and owner is at the center, acting as the decision maker and the coordinator. All right, so I'll pause here to see if there are any questions.
And just to everyone in the audience, we've been hoping for a Zoom meeting to see everybody's faces and maybe have some verbal discussion here. But please feel free to drop any questions or thoughts or contributions you want to make into the chat. The more the merrier. This will be a more enjoyable experience for everybody if there's too many questions to cover or too many topics to keep up with in the chat rather than if there's not enough. So don't be shy. We'd love to hear what you have to ask and have to say. Moving on, in the next part of our agenda, we're going to cover the design. And so what is your team going to put on this site? There is a lot that can be said about the design process, and we're going to cover 4 sort of major guiding questions that will influence what you end up designing to put onto your site. What's allowed? What do you want within the parameters of what's allowed? What does the community want? And what other requirements will you have to keep in mind that may affect your project's design? And so we're going to start with what's allowed. And the shorthand for this is often entitlements, which refers to the approvals from your city planning department that your design conforms with the existing requirements for planning and land use and zoning. So this governs what you can, and just as importantly, what you cannot build on the site that you've selected. And so just a few examples of some requirements that you're going to be designing around the use in an affordable housing context. You're going to want to make sure that the site is zoned for a residential use. Density will govern how many units, how many apartments can be built on your site. Height limits, if there's a certain number of feet or number of stories that your structures cannot exceed. Setbacks, there may be a certain required distance around the perimeter of your site from the building to the neighboring property lines or to the sidewalk in the front. You may be required to provide a certain amount of parking spaces, either per unit or for bedroom, per bedroom. And finally, floor area ratio, FAR. This took me a little longer to understand than it should have because it's fairly simple. It governs how much square footage, how much floor area can be inside your building relative to the size of the land that it's on. And so when you're in the design process, all of these requirements must be met. And as soon as you're designing a building and you bump up against one of these planning or zoning restrictions, you're sort of stuck in the design process, and you're going to have to figure out some sort of other way. So if you want to have more apartments, but you've already reached the density limit, it doesn't matter that you're within the height limits and providing enough parking and you have the right amount of floor area. Similarly, if your building would just require too many parking spaces, then you can fit. It doesn't matter that you meet all the other requirements. You're bumping up against that limit as well. To illustrate FAR very quickly, it's a ratio of the floor area in a proposed building to the floor area or the site land area on your plot of land. And so in these 3 examples, you can see a 10,000 square foot lot, each of which has a 10,000 square foot building on top of it, just taking 3 very different forms. So all of these would comply with an FAR of 1 or a ratio of 1 to 1. And if the FAR were higher, 3 to 1, you could have 3 times as much floor area. 10 to 1, you could have 10 times as much. All of these have 10,000 square feet in the building on top of 10,000 square feet of land. If you notice that third example, it looks like there's 4 stories on that building. And so one thing to check in that scenario would be if there's a height limit of 3 stories, let's say, or 30 some feet, then that design would not be possible. And you'd have to spread your 10,000 square feet around a lower and wider building like one of the first 2. For affordable housing, there are often incentives to go above and beyond the baseline zoning restrictions and planning and land use restrictions. The idea being that affordable housing is a public good, it ought to be incentivized. And so cities will provide opportunities to build extra units to either increase the density through a density bonus or increase the allowable height or decrease the parking requirements. Whatever you're bumping up against in your design, maybe there's an incentive to relax that requirement in exchange for the affordable housing units that you're providing. Adrian mentioned inclusionary affordable housing in that earlier slide. And we're going to mention it just briefly here because this is entirely an entitlements incentive. And so a market rate developer, let's say they've got a plot of land that they could build, say, 50 units on, all market rate apartments, none restricted at affordable rents to low-income tenants. The city wants affordable units. The market rate developer wants more units. So instead of 50 all at market rate, maybe they can build 60 and set aside 10% of them, 6, for low-income tenants' affordable rents. The developer will get 54 market rate units, extra market rate units. The city will get affordable units where they otherwise wouldn't have had any. And it's when there's a sort of win-win balance there. That's the idea behind inclusionary affordable housing. For publicly financed affordable housing, which is the focus of our presentation today, and especially among mission-driven nonprofit organizations, you typically see 100% affordable units anyway in a building. And so here the incentive is simply more units, more affordable units than you otherwise could build. That will serve the organization's mission, the mission of the affordable housing provider better. And as we'll see later, it will often improve the building's financial feasibility to have more units in it. There's two types of approvals that are very important when looking at entitlements, and the distinction is very important. Some designs, some projects will be subject to a by right or a ministerial approval. And in that case, there's just some requirements out there, like the base zoning or maybe an incentive program that exists. And as long as your design meets all of the requirements, it's going to be a lot of requirements. It's going to require submittals and reviews. But once you've shown that you meet all the requirements, you're approved. No one can really deny your project if it is sort of on the menu of available designs. If you're proposing something off menu, then the project is going to need additional approval. Some planning commission or design review board, or maybe even the city council, or multiple approval bodies will have the ability to say no to your off-menu proposal. Sometimes they will essentially negotiate and make a deal and say, okay, we'll approve your project if you make this, that, or the other change, which are called conditions of approval. So for example, maybe we will approve this off-menu project if you cut down the height or cut down the height on this side of the building, or change the exterior aesthetic or the architectural style. If anyone in the audience has seen any interesting conditions of approval, I saw one where the condition was that anyone working on the construction site could not take up local street parking, and they would have to either park on the construction site itself or somewhere else and take a van to shuttle folks in from like an offsite parking lot. If anyone has seen any interesting conditions of approval, please, we'd love to see them in the chat. And so if a city wants to incentivize affordable housing, another thing that they can do on the entitlements front is to make discretionary approvals. A project that would normally be subject to a discretionary approval is to make it ministerial or by right instead, which will reduce the chances of it being denied. And so SB 35 at the state level, that is an incentive program like this, where if you meet certain affordability requirements in your proposed project, then as long as you meet all of the requirements, your project is approved. In the city of LA, the Transit Oriented Communities Program, TOC, is another example of this. You got to have certain affordability. The location has to be near transit, but if all of the requirements are met, no one can deny the project. So now that you've assessed what is allowed on your site, you can finally start thinking about what you want to put on it in conformance with those parameters. A lot could be said about the design process just from the developer and the design team standpoint. We're going to focus on sort of 4 major forces that will govern what goes into your project's design. Size is the first one, and it's fairly simple. As we mentioned before, the more affordable housing units that you can put in your building, generally speaking, the better you're serving your mission. If your organization serves low-income seniors, you can serve them better by serving 60 rather than 50. Additionally, more units will generally increase the financial feasibility and viability of the project. This is for two main reasons. The first is that local and state public funding sources are often administered on a per unit basis. And so we're going to talk more about this in the financing section, but all things considered, if you have more affordable units, you will likely be eligible for more public funds to help cover the costs of developing the building. Additionally, economies of scale come into play with a larger development. And so, for example, there are going to be a lot of fixed costs that are largely the same regardless of how big the building you're proposing will actually end up being. If you think about, for example, the landscaping around the outside of the building, the trees and the other plantings in the front yard and the side setbacks, those are probably going to be pretty similar, whether it's a 2-story building or a 10-story building or anything in between. Your accountant might charge the same fee or a very similar fee, whether you've got 40 units in your building or 80. And so for all these fixed costs, when you divide out the fixed costs, which are essentially going to be the same, saying here $100,000 divided by 40 apartments is $2,500 per unit. And that's a lot more than the same fixed costs divided out over the units in a larger building. The program is what a lot of architects and design team folks is the word that they'll use to describe the interaction of the residents and other users of the building with the building itself. And so this is thinking about who are the tenants that are going to be living in the building and what is the implication on design going to be. So for senior housing, you're going to see a lot more studios and 1-bedroom units. For family housing, you're going to see a lot 2, 3, maybe 4-bedroom units or even larger sometimes. The importance of a play area or of jungle gym equipment will be more important for certain populations than for others. And so all of these considerations will go into designing the building. Common areas are directly related to this. Where is the laundry room going to be, or are you going to have multiple laundry rooms scattered throughout? Will it be next to a courtyard? Will the courtyard be in the middle at the ground level, or will there be sort of a roof deck, multi-purpose community areas, exercise rooms, all of these considerations? Some funders will have some requirements around this, as Adrian mentioned, for site amenities. Similarly, there's going to be requirements from some funders and regulators for building amenities. But there's also a lot of leeway for the design team to decide how they want the building, what amenities they want the building to have. And again, layout, what's the placement of all of these features going to be? Are they going to be clustered together or spread out? And so all of these considerations can be thought of as the building's program. Aesthetic considerations are also very important. The most prominent aspect is the exterior, what the outside of the building looks like. And there's entire degree programs on architecture and architectural styles, but the two major categories are traditional and modern. And of course, within those, there's many, many different subcategories. Quite often for the same property, as you can see here from our friends at West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation, you may very well at the beginning of the project solicit proposals from multiple architects for the same site in all different styles. And so here you can actually see, if you look at the buildings on the side, that this is the exact same site and two different proposals from two different architects for two different architectural styles of what they might put on that site. One more traditional in this case, and one more contemporary. Interior aesthetic considerations are a big thing as well. You might be hiring an interior design firm that might select some sort of overarching theme, or at the very least a color palette for the paints and for the flooring and other finishes in the building, what the sort of coherent visual appearance will be. Fixtures, there's so many choices of light fixtures and door hardware like handles and knobs, plumbing fixtures like sinks and faucets. So there's a lot of choices. Do you want it to be shiny, polished chrome, or brushed stainless steel, bronze colors, and then all different types of products and materials available as well. And finally, the layout of the units themselves. We talked about the layout of the common area in the building for the program, but within each apartment, where is the kitchen going to go? Where is the closet or the multiple closets in the bathroom or multiple bathrooms going to go? Closer to the entry or closer to the bedrooms? Will you have a balcony? Will the balcony be off of bedrooms or living rooms? All of these considerations, and it's often informed by past developments and what has worked well and what hasn't. In fact, many developers and sometimes other members of the design team will bring their own list of design standards, again, often informed by what has worked well and what has not worked on past buildings, but also sometimes just based on personal preferences. And so for design standards, we wanted to ask all of you, if you've worked with a developer or on a development project, or maybe with an architect or interior designer that brought to the project their own list of design standards, tell us, give us an example of a design element that was required or at least preferred on this list of design standards. And while folks think about it and maybe type in some answers into the chat, I'll share one from where I worked. We had a design standard item, which was no gray anything. We wanted bright, vibrant colors at the very least, but we had a prohibition on virtually anything being the color gray. Even though it's fashionable sometimes, we wanted bright, vibrant colors for our paints and carpets and everything else. So your vision will also be affected by many practical constraints. Your architect and interior designer are going to be working within the bounds of all sorts of structural and other engineering considerations, accessibility, environmental sustainability. A lot of these items that you see on the slide, and really many other trades, many other disciplines, are going to provide their own limits for what you can do design-wise. A simple example is that, imagine halfway through the design process, you or your team decide that you'd rather have the kitchen in a different spot in the apartment. Well, the plumbing and the electrical that's inside the walls that flows to that kitchen, they've already been designed out. And so now your plumbing engineer and your electrical engineer are going to have to figure out if it's possible to reroute all that infrastructure to the new location. Maybe they can, but there's a structural column in the way that they won't be able to penetrate. And so these are the types of constraints that you'll often bump into and that may sometimes compromise your ideal design. Hopefully, though, you get rid of, or you anticipate and clear out all of those potential conflicts during the design process and pre-development, and not in the field once you've started construction, because then you'll have real physical things to redesign or remove or work around, and not just drawings on a page. There's a lot of regulatory constraints. We talked about the entitlements and the planning requirements that you're going to have to work within. But additionally, affordable housing just has a lot of funders and other regulators most of whom will bring their own design standards that have to be complied with, in addition to the planning requirements and other building code considerations. And finally, budget. So all of this stuff is going to cost a lot. We're going to talk about how it gets paid for in the next section, but you're going to have a target budget and a target amount of funds available to pay for all of these costs. If it looks like, especially, several months into construction, that you're doing okay on the budget front and there haven't been surprises, you may be able to upgrade certain things, maybe try to get higher quality or more durable materials, or that nicer light fixture that everybody likes but was just really expensive compared to the others. But on the flip side, if your budget is tight, or if there were unforeseen expenses during construction that had not been budgeted for and you have to dip into your contingency, you may be downgrading certain design elements or value engineering, trying to get the most bang for the buck in terms of the decent quality and durability and decent aesthetic value at as low of a cost as possible, so that you don't run out of funds. So we have another question for the group, and this is a poll question. If you've worked on a project that has seen changes made to the design for budgetary reasons, what areas, what aspects of the design did you see changed, either upgraded or downgraded? And you can select you should be able to select multiple choices here. Hopefully this was set up as a checkbox question. If not, maybe pick the first one that comes to mind. And so, the landscaping may be less expensive or more expensive, trees and plantings, exterior outdoor finishes, the quality or the smoothness of the stucco on the outside of the building or the other siding, interior finishes like paints or countertops, furnishings, furniture, fixtures and equipment, so lighting fixtures, appliances. That's a big one where there's a wide range of prices for the refrigerator and stove and things like that. Energy sustainability features. We'll leave this open for another 30 seconds or so. And I will share it as I move on to the next slide. And if you want to share any specific details on design changes that you've seen due to budgetary reasons, please let us know in the chat. So the community plays an important role in the design as well. Community outreach is almost certainly going to be considered by any approval authority that's involved in a discretionary approval process. Your council or your design review board or your planning commission will want to see if they have approval authority over your development. They're going to want to see what sort of community outreach you've done, and they're going to consider support and they're going to consider opposition that has been submitted by members of the community. For a by right approval or a ministerial approval, remember where you just have to meet the requirements and your project will be approved. Sometimes one of those requirements is community outreach. You may have to demonstrate or document presentations to local meetings, meetings of local residents, but sometimes not. Sometimes there's not an explicit requirement for community outreach as part of the process for getting a by right or ministerial approval. But even in those cases when it's not technically required, very, very often some amount of targeted outreach or strategic outreach is still often a good idea. Certainly your city council member's office, they're going to want to know what's going on, especially if you have city or local funds that are supporting the project. Local civic organizations, a PTA at a local school, especially if it's family housing, religious institutions, a senior center, YMCA, that type of thing. And neighborhood associations, they'll want to know, even if not everybody is supportive of the project, most will say that they would appreciate knowing about it ahead of time. And the neighboring properties in particular. Eventually there's going to be construction going on for quite a long time on your site. And so the immediate neighbors, some may not be thrilled to find out about it ahead of time, but all will be much less upset, and some will really genuinely appreciate it if they know about it ahead of time before construction starts. And so the discussion around community outreach, there's a reason why it's dominated by the role of NIMBYs, people who will oppose seemingly any housing or certainly any affordable housing in their neighborhood. I support housing, just not in my backyard. But the fact of the matter is community outreach overall really often has beneficial elements. Even if you do encounter some opposition, you will also usually find reasonable and even supportive people who can provide helpful input quite often. Two other types of approvals that you're going to need to keep an eye out in the design process. Environmental approvals in California CEQA, the Environmental Quality Act. This will require you to have an environmental consultant analyze the environmental impacts of your proposed development and whether those impacts are significant, and if they're significant, whether they are mitigated in any way. Depending on how impactful, as defined by CEQA and other governing regulations, the impacts of your project may be, it might be subject to an additional approval from a government body, depending on the jurisdiction that has approval authority from the environmental perspective. CEQA is highly subject to litigation and not always for purely environmental reasons. Litigation is sometimes misused or abused in order to stop projects just by people who just oppose the project in general. And so it's always a risk, but CEQA is something that every project, not just affordable housing and not just housing, has to deal with and has to go through to a certain extent. And so some projects are exempt, and again, the analysis will show that the impacts are not great. And even if they are significant, you can still get an approval. But all of this adds time, money, and some risk to the development. In affordable housing, if you have certain federal funds, those will trigger a NEPA approval as well. NEPA is not generally as risky or costly as CEQA, but it also can add time and sometimes money to the development process. And last but not least is code compliance. So once your plans are entitled, meaning approved from the planning department, and you've gotten all your other approvals, a fully fleshed out set of the engineering drawings and the architectural drawings will be submitted to the building department, what's called plan check. So they're going to inspect it from a building code compliance standpoint, as well as any other requirements that the local buildings department may be looking for. And so more and more local departments are adding accessibility for disabled residents to their list of inspections of your plans. The state building code in California, Title 24, is a lot of energy efficiency requirements. And those local standards are layered on top of state standards, which are layered on top of the baseline international building code, which is updated every 3 years. So those are the design considerations, at least that we had time for. I see there's been some chat in the chat box. We want to take an opportunity to pause for just a couple minutes here if anyone wants to go into further elaboration. Oh, and I see some items are in the Q&A, and just a reminder to try to put your questions into the chat so that they're all in one place. I'm going to move ahead to the next section, which is on financing. So you've got your design. How are you going to pay for all this stuff? As a brief reminder from the earlier slide, as Adrian mentioned, we're focusing here on the low-income housing tax credit program, which accounts for the vast majority of affordable housing development in California and nationwide. But it's really the financing, the underlying financial structure that differentiates all of these other forms of affordable housing. So this is the LIHTC context, and it's a big slice of the pie, but there's definitely other slices out there. You are going to have a lot of different types of costs that are going to have to get paid for over the 3 major phases that we covered of the development life cycle. During pre-development, you're going to have to acquire a site, and if you're buying it from a seller, that's going to be millions of dollars in the state of California. There's going to be all of the design invoices to pay from your architects and engineers, and a lot of consultants, each of which might be relatively small, but they will add up very quickly. And so your soils inspector, your financial consultant, you're going to have accounting and attorney fees to pay, your environmental consultant for the CEQA analysis. And so the sources of funds during pre-development that are going to cover these expenses when they come due, the developer at first will presumably have some cash in the account to pay for those early expenses and fees. But eventually they're going to add up so much that you're going to likely need to take out a pre-development loan. And if you're coughing up several $1 million to acquire a site or a building to rehab, you're definitely going to need to take out an acquisition loan. And so these loans would come from lenders that understand affordable housing well enough to assess your proposed project and determine that they feel that they will get paid back on the loan with interest to make the loan worth their while. During construction is when by far the most expenses are incurred, and that is the building of the building. So it's a lot of materials and a lot of labor in a very short period of time. Lumber, concrete, steel, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, as well as many other costs that are significant, like pulling the permits to get started on the construction, and additionally many more consultants during the construction period, like your construction manager, who will accompany you as the developer to the site and help you when the architect walk the site and ask good questions about what's getting built and help you decide on any changes in the field that have to be made. It's these 3 major sources of funds that are going to cover the cost of construction and of these other development costs. We're going to talk in greater detail in a moment about each, but debt, which is a loan from a lender, some equity, which is an investment from an investor, and for affordable housing, some gap financing from a public agency. In addition to covering those costs that are going to come up during the year or 2 of development of construction, these sources will also repay those pre-development sources that temporarily covered those bills 1, 2, 3, sometimes more years before construction started. So that pre-development loan is going to get paid off, and the lender with interest, and that lender will get out of the picture. Acquisition loan, same thing. And you as the developer may have paid the first couple of architecture bills temporarily when they were due, but you're going to get reimbursed from those from your construction sources. Finally, once the building is complete and operating and occupied, you're going to have a whole different set of expenses. Rather than a bunch of one-time upfront costs to build the thing and design it, you're going to have monthly, recurring, and other ad hoc expenses for maintenance, for property management, staff salaries, utility bills for electricity and water to the building. And on the monthly and annual basis that those bills come due, the monthly and annual rent that the building collects from its tenants, and in some cases, as we'll talk about a little bit more, rental subsidy or operating subsidy, because these affordable rents are very low. That money is what will be used to cover these monthly and annual operating expenses. And this financing bullet point here and the operating expenses, this refers to loan repayments, debt service, repayments on the principal, plus payments on the interest to pay off the loan that helped you build the building during construction. So this whole picture, this is the bird's eye view. We're going to zoom in a little bit, but this whole picture, it depends on a successful operating building that can cover its expenses and repay a loan. And so that's what we're going to start on first in our more detailed assessment. The operations at a more detailed level, we're going to compare a market rate apartment building to an affordable apartment building. And so the big difference here is that at least the goal for a market rate apartment building is to have rents as high as possible, right? The highest bidder for that apartment is going to get to rent that unit. In the affordable context, the rents are regulated. It's for income levels at a certain amount, and then rents that are 30% or affordable levels of those incomes. Operating expenses, if the buildings are of the same size in the same area or county, and they have similar building amenities, they're not going to be all that different. There's not much in the way of discounts available, from plumbers and electricians and property management staff for affordable housing. And so there's going to be a lot less cash left over after the monthly and annual operating expenses are paid in the affordable building. That market rate developer will have enough cash left over to pay back what is hopefully for them a very large loan that was made to help cover the costs of development. In an affordable building, there may not be enough left over to cover any loan, or if there is, it'll be a very, very small one. And finally, a market rate developer will have an investor putting up a bunch of cash at first as well. And that investor is enticed by remaining cash month over month, year over year, to get not just their investment back, but a return on their investment as well to make it worth their while. And there's just not going to be enough cash left over for an investor to attract an investor to invest in an affordable housing development, and certainly not enough cash left over for an owner. The market rate developer is presumably a for-profit company that needs to make a profit. But even the nonprofit developers in affordable housing context, they have expenses like staff salary and office expenses and things like that that go into the building of the building. And so they need to recoup those costs as well, but there's not going to be enough money left over from these low rents after expenses are paid. And so the key to the affordable housing financing to make this actually feasible, because right now there's just not enough money available, is three main public financing interventions to help prop up this otherwise infeasible model here. The first one we covered briefly is rental subsidy or operating subsidy. Not all affordable housing developments have rental or operating subsidy, but some do. And so that will help add to the income that's coming into the building every month, every year to cover these expenses and loan payments. The second main intervention, we saw that gap financing from public agencies, and we'll cover that in a little more detail. But those sources of funding, unlike that loan from the lender, they don't require repayments on a monthly and annual basis, or if they do, it's very, very small and nominal fees. So that helps. That takes some of the pressure off of the expensive side. And finally, for the investor, who's there's still not going to be enough cash for, this is where the low-income housing tax credit comes in. So in exchange for providing that upfront investment of cash to cover the construction and development of the building, the investor will be eligible to collect tax credits and some other tax benefits over their next several years worth of tax returns. And so enough tax benefits to them in the long run will make the short run cash investment worth it for them. As for the owner, the developer fee will be a line item in the budget to allow the developer to recoup the staff time and money and office expenses and all that stuff and overhead that went into shepherding this project forward. And so just like the architect collects a fee and the accountant and the attorney and the general contractor and everybody else involved, in this case, since there won't be enough cash available from the building's operations, the developer gets a fee, one line item in the development budget. So that was the operations side, all of those recurring costs. But as we saw, we have a lot of one-time upfront costs, acquisition, construction, sometimes called hard costs, and all the other costs, which are often called soft costs for shorthand. And so let's take an example here where maybe you have a project where the land is going to cost you $4 million, where your design is budgeted at $23 million. Maybe you've got $8 million you're expecting of all the other consultants and the financing fees and the design expenses. And so you are estimating you're going to need $35 million to pay for this development. And I saw a quick question in the chat about who pays developer fee. That developer fee would be one of the many examples of soft costs here. So that would be a part of the $8 million. So altogether, you need to come up with $35 million to pay for the development of this project. We covered the three major types: debt, and a loan from a lender, equity and investment from an investor, and this gap financing for affordable housing. So the question is, how much can you come up with of each of these types of funding sources? We're going to start with debt because that is the most closely related to the operating financing of the building, which we just covered. And so you'll recall there's going to be net operating income left over after that rent and maybe the rental subsidy has been used to pay the monthly and annual operating expenses. It's going to be a lot of NOI for a market rate building and a very small amount of NOI for an affordable building. Let's just say we think in our hypothetical development here that at year end, after collecting all the year's rent and paying all the year's expenses, we'll have $350,000 remaining of rent and maybe subsidy left over. A lender will look at that, and much like a mortgage for purchasing a house where a bank will say, okay, here's what your household income is expected to be. I'll take a portion of that over, say, 30 years in exchange for making you a loan up front to make this large purchase of this house. A bank will look at that building NOI, that building remaining income, $350,000, and say, I'll take a portion of that every year over 30 years. And in exchange for making you a loan in the short term to cover the cost of your construction. We typically see 80 to 85% of the net operating income. And so that would be around $300,000 in our hypothetical project's case. And if we do the loan math, assuming I think I used a 4.5% total interest rate and over 30 years, a bank might make you a $5 million loan today or in the immediate future in exchange for collecting $300,000 a year over the next 30 years. That would eventually recoup their $5 million plus enough interest to make it worth their while to put up the $5 million in the short term for the development costs. So great, we've got $5 million towards our $35 million total development budget. And just a note here, not every affordable housing development will have enough NOI, that 350,000 figure. Not every development will be projecting enough NOI to support a perm loan at all. And so in that case, those development sources just would not include any of this debt. They would include only equity and gap financing. But let's say we can count on $5 million. And those of you in the audience who've worked on 4% projects with tax-exempt bonds, those bonds form the basis of the debt in those projects, and those bonds are administered by the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee, CDLAC. Next is the equity, which is the investment from the investor. And again, as a reminder, in the market rate context, an investor is attracted by the prospect of remaining cash year over year after expenses and loan payments. But in the affordable context, those low rents, those affordable rents for low-income households, there's not going to be enough cash left. And so instead, it's the tax benefits that an investor can get for investing and providing those upfront costs for the affordable housing development. Those who attended Tax Credit Fundamentals this morning got a lot more of the micro level detail. And those who want more detail, we encourage you to check out the partnerships website, chpc.net. and to find out when our next LIHTC 101 and 201 trainings will be. But just for now at the high level, for our $35 million project, there may be around $25 million of tax credit eligible costs. This is eligible basis for those who attended this morning. And depending on the type of tax credit and which funding round you applied in, maybe you can anticipate qualifying for $22 million of tax credits for your project. Now, you as the developer, you can't pay the architect with a tax credit. You can't pay the general contractor with a tax credit. And so it's the investor that comes in and provides the real money, the cash up front, in exchange for collecting those $22 million of tax credits and some other tax benefits over the next 10 to 15 years. And so this represents, I think, 90 or 91 cents per tax credit, which is, within the ranges that we see these days of what an investor might put up today for $22 million worth of tax credits in the long run. And low-income housing tax credits are administered in this state by the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee, TCAC. So for those keeping score at home, we're up to $25 million of funding sources, but we still need $10 million more to cover the full 35. That's where public funds come in, city, county, state, sometimes federal funds. In exchange for more requirements on the project, they will offer, or you can apply at least, for public funds. Those additional requirements may require that your income and rent levels are decreased to lower levels. They may require units to be set aside and reserved for specific populations. And virtually all of them will come with their own design requirements, their own financial underwriting requirements that ensure that the project is well budgeted enough and has enough of a cushion to be feasible and not run into trouble, while at the same time demonstrating a need for these public scarce resources. Inspections, they're all going to have compliance and sometimes inspections during operations. And many of these funders will send inspectors to the construction site as well. So maybe your county has a NOFA, a Notice of Funding Availability, out right now that you want to apply for, and you think that you can qualify for $3 million, and maybe that'll require your income and rent limits to be decreased more than the tax credits alone would require. And maybe you are considering serving veterans and homeless veterans, and you see that the Veterans Housing and Homelessness Program is currently available from the state, from the Housing and Community Development Department, HCD. And so youth have looked at that, and you think that you can apply for $7 million of VIP funds, which is due on July 15th, I believe. Voila, there is your $10 million of GAP funds and your $35 million of total development sources that you're going to need to pay for your total development costs. And here are some logos of some of the biggest public agencies in the state, although there's many, many more. So we've covered the full financing sort of life cycle here. We've seen how the operations, how the operations needs to be financially sustainable on a monthly and annual basis despite these low rents. We've seen how that ties in to repayments on a loan that was provided to cover some of the costs of construction and to repay those temporary pre-development sources. Those of you who've worked on a funding application or have seen pro formas know that there's something a little bit missing from what I've been calling construction sources here. And typically those are actually broken into two subphases of their own. You're not going to have all of that equity available during construction. You're not going to have, usually not going to have all of the gap financing available either during construction. And so you're going to need an additional temporary source of funds here. Just like those pre-development sources were temporary, a construction lender will come in and make a very short-term loan, just 12 to 24 months, just for the period of construction. And it's only once the building is built and completed and operational and construction is over that the remaining equity, the remaining gap financing, and that perm loan, that mortgage that we talked about, those permanent sources or final sources, you could call it, those come in and pay off the construction loan and get the construction lender out of the picture, just like those construction sources paid off the pre-development and acquisition lender and got them out of the picture as well. So this is sort of the full, reasonably detailed overview of affordable housing finance. We want to pause for questions here. And yes, we see that there are 58 minutes remaining in the session. Thank you, Housing California, for that. we wanted to schedule an opportunity for Q&A or discussion here. So let's pause and see if there's anything left in the chat. But otherwise, we might skip ahead to our break. Janice, Adrian, Chad, you've been able to monitor the Q&A so far. Do any of you want to make the call here on Q&A time or jumping into the break?
I think it'd be worth addressing some of these questions around CEQA and community engagement and how to work with NIMBYs, if you have to work with NIMBYs. I don't have a lot of great experience with this, but I don't know, Ben, if you have some examples of suggestions or techniques for how to best work with community.
Yeah, a lot can be said, and I forgot to put my poll out, so I'm gonna, or the chat question out. So let me just share the chat question real quick. In the financing section, we covered 3 major public interventions of funds to prop up the low rents in an apartment building that has affordable housing restrictions. And so if you can jog your memory and remember one of those 3 types of public funding interventions to help make these things feasible, tell us in the chat. Please share in the chat. I think that for community outreach and opposition, it's so case by case. It depends so much by developer, if they're a community organization with deep roots in that particular neighborhood, or if they're, maybe newer to the area and don't know the folks as well. What's the sort of official or higher level support? Is this a city council member or a city council that is more favorable or sees affordable housing development more favorably or less favorably? It really depends case by case. And there's also just personal preference. Doing outreach comes with a risk and a reward. The risk of encountering opposition that you might not have encountered if you had just gone through your approval process more quietly. But of course, the reward is finding supporters. And at the very least, for people that may not ever become fully a supporter, there's a lot who will at least appreciate or be less oppositional if they've seen that the outreach was made, and they can at least understand that this is a mission-driven organization whose goal is to, build low-income family housing or something, that's what they're going to do, and that's what they have to do, and these are the rules and the entitlements, and this is what's allowed on the site, and it is what it is. But it really will depend on a case-by-case basis on virtually all of the factors involved. That's not a very satisfying answer. I don't know if anyone else has other contributions for it.
I would just say quickly, in my experience, even if you're not required to do any community engagement, it can be a best practice to, reach out to neighbors, local community organizations ahead of time, share your vision with them and work to get buy-in. So do community work ahead of time to hopefully avoid any big issues that could come up later on. So a lot of affordable housing providers might have, a community organizing team, or could partner with community organizing local organizations to do that work together.
Yeah. I was also thinking, Adrian, as you were talking, that building support is often at least a more efficient use of time than trying to win over opposition. There's always going to be opposition, and saying no or opposing something is often a more motivating thing. So it may require more work to get your supporters out there, but those supporters really do quite often exist. And so it takes some effort to bring them out and say, hey, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but the opposition is not the only opinion that's out there, and this support should count for something too.
Thanks. And then Ben, do you want to just quickly go over what the 3 categories of?
Yes, thank you. So some projects will have rental or operating subsidy, and so that will help support those low rents to cover the expenses and the loan payments and help on that front, on the project income front. The second was at least in the operations, there's no particular order here, but the second one on that list was the fact that those public funds, those public agency gap funds, don't require repayments, or if they do, they're very, very small. And so unlike a market rate developer who's got to pay back and then some every single funder, You will have some funders that don't require repayment, those city, state, county, local funds. And then finally, it's the tax incentives, which are used to attract an investor, since there won't be enough cash to attract an investor.
Do we want to take maybe just a 2-minute break for folks to stretch their legs, and then we'll jump back into a case study that sort of explains or gives context to what Ben has just been talking about, and then we'll move forward from there. So if you want to reconvene at 2:10.
Okay.
All right, we'll go ahead and restart. So after Ben went through all of that really valuable information, we just wanted to provide a case study to give a little bit of context for how these concepts look when they're applied in the real world. So as I mentioned, prior to working with the California Housing Partnership, I was a project manager with Mutual Housing California. And I had the opportunity to work on a really awesome project called Lavender Courtyard by Mutual Housing that we'll just talk about a little bit today. So it'll tie back to many of the concepts we've already discussed, such as the community and a vision for the project, site selection, assembling a team, by right entitlements, financing, and then finally, construction. All right, so this is a picture, or I guess a rendering. It's still under construction, so not yet complete. So Lavender Courtyard by Mutual Housing is for LGBTQ seniors over the age of 62. So how this project came to be is that community members came to Mutual Housing and said, we really feel like this is a missing part of our community. There are LGBTQ affordable senior housing developments throughout the United States, including in Minneapolis, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Philadelphia. And folks are really saying, we think Sacramento needs this as well. So really awesome that the vision for this development came from the community, and Mutual Housing decided to carry that vision with the community and move it forward. So that takes us to site selection. So when you're really thinking about how to make people feel safe, the location of the site was really important. So Sacramento has an LGBTQ neighborhood called Lavender Heights. So a site was selected in this area to ensure that people would feel as safe as possible. So that's how the site was selected, and it was purchased off the market. So this site is about 0.6 acres. It has nearby amenities, which is also really important when considering a senior population. So there's a bus stop right out front. Also, the zoning really dictated a lot of the design. So Mutual Housing decided to go to the full 4 stories that were permitted with the zoning, and were able to fit about 53 units on this site. So after working with the architect to kind of flesh out the design, we then went to the contractor to get an early construction estimate, and really started to develop the budget to figure out what kind of financing we'd pursue given the design limitations and the site. So once we got the budget, that really revealed what kind of funding was necessary. So there's a decision to be made of whether to pursue 4% tax credits or 9% tax credits. It looked like with the assumptions that were being made, the 9% tiebreaker was not incredibly competitive. So it made sense to go with 4% tax credits. And that was assumed. So even though the tax credits were not secured at that early point, we kind of had an idea of how many tax credits we'd be expecting. So with that information, the first stop was to the city for local funding. The city was willing and able to commit a couple $1 million to the project, which was excellent. And once we had that, we then kind of were able to further refine what the gap looked like. So it looked like there was a gap of a little over $10 million that needed to be filled after taking into account the local funds and the tax credit equity. Because the rents were fairly low, there is no permanent loan or mortgage, as Ben talked about it, that would be able to be supported by this project. So it's really just equity and then gap funding from state and local agencies. So our first attempt at state funding through HCD was the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, or also called ASIC. So this program really aims to reduce greenhouse gases and limit the number of vehicle miles traveled. So at the time that we applied for this, senior projects were not very competitive for ASIC, and so we were not successful at that attempt of filling that $10 million gap. So the second attempt was through a program called the National Housing Trust Fund. When this money was released, there was only $30 million in the whole state available, which is not very much, as state funding is already incredibly competitive and oversubscribed. So unfortunately, again, we were not successful in securing those funds. So shortly after that, a new NOFA was released called the Multifamily Housing Program, or MHP. And how to compete for MHP is by having the lowest average affordability. So in order to be competitive, we were able to get more vouchers for the property to further lower the rents. We had a lowest average affordability score of 32%. So we did have to do some restructuring in order to compete for MHP, but we were successful, which was very exciting. So after securing that MHP award, we went in for 4% tax credits and bonds, and were successful with the first attempt. And then construction began in October of last year in 2020, and an 18-month construction period is assumed. So it is well on its way to being completed. Now I'll pass it on to Janice.
Yeah, okay, hopefully I do this screen share correctly. Let's see. Are you seeing the agenda right now?
Yes, we are.
Great. All right, so what happens now? You have, you've completed acquisition of the property. You've closed on your construction financing. And as any of you know who have gone through closing before, you get to breathe a sigh of relief because it's a slog to get there. And you have your groundbreaking, lots of photos are taken and speeches are made. But then what? Your job's not done. You have a year to 2 years of construction. And of course, it depends on how large your project is, where it's located, if it's phased or not. You know, it can be shorter or longer than that 12 to 24 month period, but that's pretty typical. During this time, this is when the rubber really hits the road. You get to find out if you allowed enough time for construction, if you budget enough money, if you chose a team that can work through problems effectively as they arise. All the planning that you did during pre-development becomes real during this time. Okay, so starting with the team, the main players during this period are the general contractor, architect, developer. They're meeting every week to make sure that things are going to plan, or at least as close to plan as possible. You guys know the gist of what the general contractor and architect do. General contractor builds the building, the architect designs it. The developer, you know, if everything went totally smoothly, the developer would have almost nothing to do but cut the checks. But of course, there are always challenges during construction. So the roles that the GC, architect, and the developer play become a little more complicated. And it really starts to matter who's on your team, how well they work together, and how well you plan for these challenges during pre-development. So starting with the contractor, you know, it's the general contractor and their subs who are really the ones who are doing the hard work on the front lines, building the building. Some examples of the kinds of things that they might have to contend with during construction. It could be the subcontractors themselves. I had one project where the low voltage security sub was just sort of in over their heads, and we're having a really hard time implementing this complicated security system that we had planned. You know, key cards weren't working, cameras had the wrong timestamps. It was really a mess. The GC, fortunately, was a very competent, seasoned GC, and they were able to work with the sub to get a new, more senior team assigned to the project who could actually implement the program. So it took a little time, it took a little cajoling, but the GC was able to get that change made, and now we have a functioning system. And then sometimes it's materials that cause a problem. As you all know, lumber prices are skyrocketing right now. So who you select for a GC is really important in terms of, are they able to think ahead and plan for this kind of escalation? Are they setting aside enough contingency for it? Are they setting aside allowance? Are they able to purchase the lumber ahead of time and store it before they need it to save on, to sidestep any future escalation? I remember a few years ago when there were tariffs being put on products coming out of China that really impacted the acquisition of solar panels. So I had a contractor who bought them all ahead of time, stored them on site, and then installed them later in the construction process, but that saved us a lot of money. Another player that can pose a challenge is weather. You have no control over the weather. And of course, a good contractor will be watching the weather religiously to make sure that, you know, if they're planning to pour concrete one day, it's not going to be raining the next and mess up the curing of the concrete, or wanting to put the roof up before the rainy season. Those are really important things that if you get wrong, your schedule can be blown. And then schedule generally is a problem. There are lots of things that can affect schedule, including the coordinating the schedules of other players. For example, there's one project that I know of that's under construction right now that's doing modular construction. And the contractor that's doing the modular units changed their schedule last minute. The GC had already engaged a crane to be on site to set the modules and couldn't change the dates. And that crane costs $30,000 every day that those modules don't show up. So, so choosing the schedule can have a real impact on finances. And so during the pre-development period, you want to make sure that you have enough contingency and that you're thinking about what the possible changes might be to schedule that can affect your budget try to leave enough buffer to account for those things. And then neighbors, a favorite topic. So, regardless of how much outreach you do during pre-development, you are probably going to get complaints during construction because construction is loud, it's noisy, it's dusty, and neighbors are going to feel that. They're going to be impacted. So you want to have a general contractor who's able to be flexible and creative and working with them. Maybe they change the hours that they do loud, especially loud work, to maybe after 9 a.m. or before 3, so that it limits the effect on people around them. And then permits and inspectors. The general contractor's job isn't done until the inspectors say it's done. And so it's really important that you have a GC who knows how to work with inspectors and who the inspectors are too. Each inspector is so specific in what they're looking for that regardless of whatever the requirements are on the books, the inspector can ask for something else. And it's not uncommon for an inspector during pre-development to okay something and then have another inspector or the same inspector even during construction say something else, change their mind and be like, no, forget what was agreed to before. I want this other thing, you have to do it. So this is where it becomes really important that your GC and your architect are able to adapt quickly and make changes really quickly to minimize changes to budget and schedule as much as possible. Okay, so your architect, along with their engineers, as was previously mentioned, usually the plumbing, mechanical, electrical engineers, and sometimes structural are typically under the architect's contract. So if all goes well, basically what they're doing is they're just verifying that the construction meets their plans and specifications. But of course, things always come up. So there's usually a need to modify plans and specs as needed. And as Ben was mentioning, there are things like substitutions, value engineering, and alternates that come up during pre-development. And from my experience, it's helpful to have a handful of add alternates, a handful of deduct alternates in your back pocket, ready to go, so that if you do see changes in budget during the course of construction, you can easily implement them. You already have them sort of packaged and priced and sized and all those things, and just need to be done instead of having to, think on the fly of like, okay, what can we add now? What can we cut now? You already have those things figured out. So the developer, again, if everything goes well, all they do is cut checks, but things always come up. So they, with the construction manager, are essentially the central decision makers. They have to take into account what the end users need, what the funders want, what's happening on site with the contractor, and using all that information, find a path forward, and then eventually approve or not approve any change orders that might come up, and approve pay-ups and cut the checks. I don't know how many of you know Carol Galante, former FHA commissioner, the Obama administration. She was once a young project manager, and she's told the story once about walking into one of these weekly meetings with her contractor and architect, and they were arguing about something, and there was clearly they weren't agreeing on how to move forward. And she sort of stopped them and was like, look, if you don't explain to me exactly what the problem is in terms that I can understand, because I'm not an expert in construction, I'm not an expert, architect. Explain to me what's happening, I'll figure it out, and then nobody gets paid until I understand. So I think that's a really good way to think about who the developers are. They tend not to be experts in any one thing, but they are very good at collecting the information they need to make an informed decision. Now, behind the scenes, not necessarily at these weekly meetings, but definitely omnipresent are the funders. They are there for monthly inspections and reports. They do the monthly pay draws. They're the ones who are actually okaying the expenses that the developer says should be paid. And during pre-development, you come up with your budget, you come up with your schedule. The funders are the ones who are really keeping you to it. So the better fleshed out you can make your budget and your schedule, the more thought you put into it during pre-development, the more realistic you can make it, the easier the process is going to be during construction, working with the funders and convincing them to pay the costs that you've incurred. Okay, so quick poll question. What kinds of decisions have you seen made during pre-development that caused issues during construction. I'm gonna launch this. Okay, give you a few minutes there. So have you seen issues with site selection? Like maybe there were some on-site discoveries that you weren't expecting to find that caused issues, or challenges with neighbors, or were there issues with your team not working well together or underperforming? Are there problems with design where maybe some materials that were specified were really hard to get your hands on or were really expensive, or you didn't have enough add or deduct alts in hand, or financing, you didn't have enough money, or any other thing you can think of? I'll give you 10 more seconds. Okay. All right. So it looks like a lot of people have seen issues with site selection. Oh, that's interesting. And a lot of design issues and financing. Okay. If you have any particularly egregious issues pop up that you want to share for the purposes of storytelling, please pop it in the chat. We'd love to hear. Okay. So, so what next? You finished construction, you've got your permit signed off on, now you have lease-up and operations. You've gotten your temporary certificate of occupancy or your final certificate of occupancy, grand opening, again, lots of photos taken, lots of speeches made, but the hard work is really happening behind the scenes with lease-up and operations. Lease-up typically will take 3 to 6 months. And operations, again, as Adrienne mentioned earlier, it's required to be at least 55 years by regulation, but the goal is that these buildings operate as affordable housing in perpetuity. All right, so in this stage, the main players are property management, resident services, and asset management. Property management, their basic roles during lease up is the marketing and the tenant selection. Now, one of the things that can really affect their work during this period is how complicated the developer was in setting up their unit mix. So I know I saw this one project recently that had some units set aside for formerly homeless, some units set aside for farm workers. Both subsets were split across 3 income levels. It was a really complicated, very, very complicated unit mix. And that makes it hard for property management to track and keep records on. So that's just something to think about on the developer side during pre-development, that your property management team is going to have to live with this throughout all the operations. So as simple as you can make it is better if feasible. Okay, and then timely lease up. This is really important during pre-development and actually during construction as well. It's really important that the project manager, the development side of the shop, communicates clearly with the property management team about what the expected schedule for lease up is, because it affects the amount of equity that's going to come into the project from the investor. The investor is going to expect a certain lease up schedule, a certain number of credits to be earned in that first year. And if the lease up is slower, they're probably going to reduce their equity pay-in by some amount. If lease up is faster, they might, if you negotiate right with them during pre-development, they might actually give you more money. So just having that communication with property managers is really important so they know what's expected and how it affects the finances of the development project. And then property management also does the income certifications every year to ensure that residents are still meeting the requirements put forth by funders. And generally ongoing operations and maintenance, which includes rent collection, repairs, and reports to various different parties. Now, some things that get decided during pre-development that would affect their ability to do that piece of their work is what's the durability or replaceability of the materials that were chosen for the property? How easy are the systems to maintain? One of the things that I've seen a lot of as a project manager was that we would try to implement these new technologies for say energy efficiency that frankly were more complicated than your old steam heater or whatever to maintain. And over the course of operations, maintenance was not as great as one would have hoped, and we weren't seeing this source of energy efficiency savings that we were expecting because we just didn't coordinate well enough with property management to make sure that they understood what was needed to maintain these systems. And then things like building layout, size and location of property management office space, security considerations, those are all design considerations during pre-development that affect their day-to-day work during operations. And then of course, budget. Did the development team budgeted enough for property management to do what they need to do? So it's really important to keep in mind. And then you have resident services, who are saints. They do so much with so little. So they do everything that under the sun that could be of use to residents. Basically, they do provide all the support that a resident could possibly want or need, including referrals to outside resources. They could do individual counseling. If any issues arise between tenants or with property management, they step in to provide conflict resolution. They host social activities. They create a community within the building. Their work is so crucial, and so often they do not get enough money to do what they do. And sometimes that's an issue with the development team not budgeting enough. Sometimes it's actually an issue with funders not allowing enough money to be put in the budget. So I don't have a really good solution for that, but whenever you can toss more money their way, I think the better. And then you have asset management, who becomes sort of the new central decision maker. The developer, project manager, they pass the baton over to asset management. And asset management is the one who then, during the life of the property, during operations, they coordinate with the property management folks on site, with residents and with funders. They sort of take the differing needs between those parties and find a path forward to make sure that the property remains physically and fiscally healthy. They take care of insurance and reserves, and they do the capital needs assessments every so often and see if the property needs physical work done. Some of the things that affect their work that gets decided during pre-development or construction is, again, durability of materials, how the building is designed to reduce hazards, how energy efficient the building is, and again, how much money was budgeted for operations. Okay. One thing I just want to highlight is that asset management, we had an executive director where I used to work who likened the relationship that developers, project managers have with properties as like this hot, fiery affair that's like super intense but super short-lived. And then the asset management relationship with the property is more like this like caring, like long-term relationship. Like asset management is really the one that lives with the building and all the decisions that the developers make during pre-development and construction. So be very mindful of what you're handing them as you make your decisions, because they have to live with it. All right. And speaking of the developer, there are some last things the developer does during the early lease up and operations period before they fully pass the baton to asset management. And these are tasks involved with conversion from construction financing to permanent financing. There's a question in the chat about that earlier. There are two closings. There's the construction financing closing at the beginning of the project, and then the perm conversion at the end. In order to get to perm conversion, there are a lot of lender requirements, including knowing what the final cost of building a project was. And the developer will usually work with a CPA to get those costs certified and finalized. And then they work to convert the project to permanent financing, submit the place in service application to TCAC that says, here's what it costs, here's the tax rents we believe we are owed, and sort of finalizes that, closes the loop with TCAC there. TCAC will then send back an 8609 form that says, yes, you have earned this number of tax credits. And at that point is when the investor will usually put in their final equity installment. Okay. So we already talked a little bit about some of the closeout requirements for perm conversion, but to get into a little more detail, usually funders will be looking for lien-free completion, some closeout reports, if there are like any environmental things that they want to make sure got taken care of during construction. They'll look to see that you have typically 90% occupancy for 3 months, 90 days, and that you've achieved 1.15 debt service coverage ratio during that time as well. We want to see that the project is performing as was projected. And then if you have a bond project, a 4% credit bond project, you'll also have to show that you have met your 50% test, which is to say that at least 50% of the aggregate basis costs through place in service, the end of place in service year, were paid for by bond funding. And then, as Ben mentioned earlier, funders will also have regulatory restrictions and will have authority to approve budgets or not approve budgets over the course of operations. And investors in particular will be looking at their credit delivery schedule. They'll want to see that the project is delivering all the credits, meeting all the TCAC requirements to deliver credits every year as expected. And if they don't, then they're going to want to be compensated for any shortfalls. And lastly, if there are vouchers on the project, operational subsidy, rental subsidy vouchers, then you'll have annual HUD inspections as well to show that the property is being maintained as healthy housing. So again, all the decisions you make during pre-development and construction, the better you negotiate with your funders, because all these things get determined before construction even starts, all these requirements and restrictions. The better you negotiate those items during pre-development, the easier it's going to be for your team during operations to meet these requirements and work with funders. Okay, so the last poll question of the session. What are the kinds of decisions made during pre-development and construction that you've seen cause issues during lease-up and operations? Same general options here as last time. Was it with site selection, where maybe the neighborhood doesn't have the amenities needed for residents, or team selection, again, teams not working well together or team members underperforming, design, were there issues with materials, with building layout, and financing, was there enough money budgeted? Were there issues with the income mix? Give you 15 more seconds. Okay. Okay, so it looks like there were a lot of problems with financing. Yeah. I think there's a tendency for project managers during pre-development and construction to just make the numbers work. You know, whatever is needed, just make them work to get through the project. But of course, often that means cutting costs where costs are actually really needed and has real effects down the line during operations. So as much as developers and project managers cannot do that, the better. But sometimes you're just stuck between a rock and a hard place where you have to make these hard decisions. Okay. So
hey, Denise, we had a quick lease-up question from Deborah Palmer. A great question about just the role of the lease-up timing in relation to the investor.
Yeah. Sorry, do you mind actually just I'm not seeing it immediately. Do you mind just reading it to me?
Oh yeah, no, just if you could elaborate. So you had mentioned that if lease up is slower, the investor might reduce their investment, and if it's faster, they might increase the investment. So just the underlying why.
Yeah, so it comes down to the time value of money, basically. So the sooner, well, actually, so the way that the tax credits are calculated in the first year is based on how much of that year the units were occupied by qualifying tenants. So if you can show that, say, you had that 90% of the units were leased up by February, and then the rest of the units were leased up by March, then most of that year you're collecting tax credits, and that translates into to more tax benefits in the investor's pocket, which then translates into more equity that they give the project. Let's say that you are slow on leasing up and you don't start leasing until like the middle of the year, till June. and you're only collecting approximately half of the tax credits in that year that than were projected, then that means fewer tax incentives to the investor, and then less equity from them to you. Does that help? Okay, so let's hop over to the recapitalization. Recapitalization, also known as refinancing, or in the case of a project that previously had tax credits and is looking to get a new allocation of tax credits, resyndication, or broadly speaking, just rehabilitation. So this usually happens at the end of a tax credit compliance period, which is 15 years from the first year credits. And when those capital needs assessments that the asset management team has been doing comes back saying, yeah, this building needs a lot of work. It has a lot of problems that need to get fixed. You need more money to do it. So recapitalization process is starting the whole process over again. Starting with project concept, the project concept actually doesn't change very much because you have an existing property, you have an existing regulatory restriction or set of regulatory restrictions, and you have existing tenants. Like, you're not going to change the building program from serving all families to all formerly homeless veterans. Like, that's not realistic, nor would you want to. So during feasibility and pre-development, though, there are a lot of new things that you have to do over again. So you have to build a new team. Often the contractor and architect during a rehab are different from the team that was on board for the original construction. The design and the plans need to be done brand new. The building is going to have different needs that need to be addressed. You might have new requirements imposed by anticipated funding. In the case of one project that I had when I was a project manager, it was an old SRO building that didn't meet current building code. So we needed to put in new systems, new finishes, but also we need to turn those SRO units into studios. So installing kitchens into each of those units. And also the hallways were so narrow that we actually need to widen them in order to meet new accessibility standards. So the design is going to be brand new. And with brand new designs comes brand new entitlements and a new round of plan check. Usually this process is simpler because it is an existing building, at least on the entitlement front. But sometimes you'll have missed things in the first round that then need to get fixed during the rehab. So the same project that I spoke about earlier, we had converted a couple units into resident services space because the building really needed it. And that was approved by all of the parties involved back when we did the change, but we didn't actually get it on the books with the building department and with planning. And we had to do that in conjunction with this rehab. So it can be a little bit of extra work sometimes, depending on how well you did it the first time, but usually it's simpler. Okay. Financing, you're going to need new sources. That's the whole point of recapitalization. So you'll also need to address your existing financing in addition to getting new ones. You'll either have to repay or recast your existing debt. And sometimes, as mentioned earlier, sometimes your new funding can have impacts on your design and how you design your rehab. For example, if you're using 221D4 financing, they'll look for seismic improvements that save the bulk of the building. Whereas TCAC, they'll be looking for seismic improvements that just get people enough time to get out of the building before it collapses. So that'll really affect how you design your structural plans and et cetera. Lastly, in order to do any recapitalization, or especially if you're looking for a new influx of tax credits, you need your existing investor to exit. This is a really hot topic right now. There's actually a whole session coming up after this one on year 15 exits. Unfortunately, it's become more of a trend for investors to sort of renege on the initial agreement of just leaving after year 15 after they've gotten their projected tax benefits, and instead staying in because they see that they can maybe get more money out of the deal. I think Chad is going to drop a few links in the chat that you can take a look at that sort of flesh out this issue in more detail. It's a really interesting issue, and it's really kind of horrifying in terms of what it says about the tax credit industry. But anyway, moving forward. So recapitalization, construction during recapitalization is a little different from new construction as well, because you have existing tenants. So you need to plan your rehab around those existing tenants. This will often take the shape of how you phase your construction. You might do like little pieces of the building at a time, so you only have to move out tenants in small groups. And relocation, of course, you need to figure out how you're going to move folks safely offsite and safely back while construction is being done on their units. And of course, you want the rehab to work for the tenants. You want their input on how the building can be better, what materials should be used if different from what's already there. Often it's nice to ask them, like what do you want the color palette to be? Because that can have a really big effect on their experience of the building. So any input you can get from tenants, the better. The end product will be better. During lease up and operations in a recapitalization scenario, it's actually not that different necessarily, or there's not such a distinct lease up and operations period, because oftentimes there are no new lease ups and operations might be ongoing during construction if you still have residents on site. So in the end, you have a nicer building and maybe happier tenants, but it's not as stark a transition from construction to lease up. You will have some new funder requirements though, depending on who your new funders are. And if you're getting a new set of tax credits, you'll have to, the property management team will have to do a new set of income certifications to make sure that tenants meet the income requirements for this new round of credits. All right. And then after, the next 15, 20 years of use after rehab, then you start it all over again when, again, the capital needs assessment comes back saying that the project needs more work. And that is it for our presentation. Okay. Do we have any questions in the chat that we should discuss?
I think the earliest one that I see is just about the timing of the tax returns with the placed in service package. If any of you are more suited to answer this, please jump in. I have some general thoughts. This is Randy Wilson's question from 241. And I was just going to say oh, Janice, you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, sorry.
Just on a basic level. So the partnership that owns the development, they're going to have to file a tax return every year. And so the incentive is for the placed in service package to be submitted as soon as possible so that the 8609, which is the actual tax credit, can be available as soon as possible to hopefully be in time for the current year tax return, not the next year's one. It is possible to amend a prior year tax return. There was that got a little bit tricky with some IRS guidance, I think last year, the year before. But generally speaking, an amended tax return for a prior year when the tax credits are first eligible, that's usually an option as well. But yeah, you have until September of every year to file every year's tax return.
Yeah, and I'll just say that the amending of previously filed returns, I think, is no longer current practice. Your CPA, and I'm not a CPA, so don't hold me to this, but I believe that your CPA can, at the time of filing, can say, we reasonably expect that these tax credits have been earned, and sort of get it on the books that way. But yeah, for IRS reasons, they've decided that they can't go back and amend easily anymore.
Deborah asked about why a new construction building would need to be rehabbed after just 15 years. Janice, in all your rehab experience, what was the typical age of the building?
It was well past 15 years for sure. My last two rehab projects had probably gone, oh geez, like probably a solid 30-ish years without having had like a proper rehab. So yeah, it's not necessarily super common for a rehab to be needed within 15 years, but yeah.
And Chad also elaborated on that, I see in the chat.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of it comes down to like how sturdy were the materials that you selected and how much wear and tear are residents putting in. It's like it really depends. Yeah.
Any volunteers for over income tenants? This is a question from Lee.
Yeah, so during operations, tenants can have their income levels increase and still qualify for a tax credit unit as long as they don't move out. And there is a limit, I think an upper limit on how much over the initial AMI target they can go. But in the case of like a resyndication where you have existing tenants who might not necessarily qualify anymore with the new round of tax credits, yeah, unfortunately, those units then become market rate units technically, and you cannot claim credits on them. Yeah. Are there any other questions in here?
Well, before everyone leaves, we want to share a survey. This is a relatively new presentation of ours and that we hope to give again, but we hope to make it better and better. And so we would all really appreciate the feedback, everybody at the partnership, not just us, on what worked, what didn't, and other thoughts and feedback that you might have. It's not too long, but we hope you'll all click the link in the chat and give us your feedback about this presentation.
That's a good question about replacement reserves. Yeah. Yeah, so reserves will stay with the project. Usually funders will require that and not let it be dispersed upon sale or resyndication. Last call for questions. Not well. Let you all go enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for joining us.
Take care.